Good evening, and thank you for slipping into Sleepy Kitchen with me. I'm so glad you've made it here with me. Tonight, let's begin with one fact that opens the whole world of mushrooms. What we cook and slice as a mushroom is usually only the fruiting body, a short-lived surface appearance, while the main organism lives as mycelium, a fine network that spreads through soil or wood and can persist for a long time. Once that clicks, a lot starts to feel intuitive. Mushrooms can seem to arrive overnight after rain. Certain spots keep producing them year after year, and the ground beneath trees stays busy even when nothing is visible. From there, the subject widens in an easy, kitchen-friendly way. Familiar, edible mushrooms and the textures that set them apart. Wild and specialty types, and the lookalikes that make caution necessary. The basics of spores, growth, and the partnerships fungi form with roots and trees. Cultivation and farming. Plus what happens in heat when moisture leaves, browning begins, and savory flavor deepens. At the edges are the stranger corners too. Glowing species, cultural history, and the environmental work fungi do as steady recyclers. If you'd like more cozy kitchen facts for bedtime, you can subscribe or simply come back anytime. But for now, let your breathing slow down and settle into the sound of this story. Let's begin. On the tree of life, fungi are generally considered more closely related to animals than to plants. One everyday way to ground that is stored energy. Many fungi and animals store energy mainly as glycogen, while plants typically store it as starch. Fungi also build their cell walls with chitin, a tough material you can recognize in nature in places like insect shells. Plants, by contrast, rely on cellulose for much of their structure. The point is not that a mushroom is an animal. The point is that fungi share some deep traits with animals that plants do not, and that helps explain why fungi behave like neither. The simple takeaway is this: mushrooms follow their own rules, even when they sit beside vegetables in a store. A mushroom is not the whole fungus, but the fruiting body, the part built to make and release spores. A useful comparison is an apple on a tree. The apple is not the whole tree, and the mushroom is not the whole fungus. It is the structure that appears when it is time to reproduce. The underside surfaces, whether they look like gills, pores, or tiny teeth, are mainly about creating a lot of spore-producing area without taking up much space. Spores are microscopic, so one mushroom can release an enormous number. You do not see a dramatic scatter. It is more like a quiet dusting into the air than like a few visible seeds. Most of a fungus lives as mycelium, a network of thread-like cells that spreads through soil, wood, mulch, or the decaying layer under leaves. Those threads can be thinner than a human hair, and they branch constantly. That branching lets them explore tiny spaces and collect resources across a wide area without forming a single trunk. In the right habitat, a single fungal individual can cover a surprisingly large footprint, sometimes many acres. Evidence suggests some can persist for centuries. A few famous examples are estimated even older, though exact ages can be hard to prove. If you have ever noticed fine white threads clinging to the base of a mushroom, that is mycelium showing itself. Fungi are among nature's main decomposers, meaning they help break down dead organic matter into simpler building blocks that can be reused. Instead of eating in bites, many fungi release enzymes into their surroundings and then absorb what those enzymes free up. It is a steady way to feed on materials that would be hard to chew or swallow. In a home compost pile, the same basic idea shows up when tougher bits like stems, and woody scraps slowly soften and darken over time, helped along by fungi working through the heap. Without decomposers like fungi, nutrients can stay locked up in dead material for much longer, and the next season has less to work with. When people say mushrooms, they usually mean the fungi that form visible fruiting bodies. But that visible group is only one slice of fungal diversity. Scientists have described tens of thousands of mushroom-forming species worldwide, and many more likely remain undocumented, especially in regions that are under-surveyed. Some are easy to miss because their fruiting bodies are small, short-lived, or only appear under a narrow set of conditions, so the records are always catching up. That is why a field guide can feel thorough and still represent only a small window into what exists. Even when you are holding a full, sturdy cap, you are seeing only a fraction of the organism. The above-ground mushroom is often temporary, appearing when conditions are right, while the mycelium below keeps feeding, repairing, and expanding over much longer spans of time. In that way, a mushroom is closer to a bloom than to a body, something produced to spread spores and then retired when the job is done. This is why a patch can look empty for weeks and then suddenly offer a cluster, even though the fungus has been present and active all along. Some mushrooms can expand quickly once conditions line up, sometimes within hours after rain or a jump in humidity. The fast appearance is often possible because the fungus has already done preparation below the surface, and the fruiting body is built to inflate and unfold rapidly when moisture arrives. Other species build more slowly, showing up over days or even weeks, especially when temperatures are cooler or the food source is harder to break down. The timing can vary even in the same neighborhood from one week to the next, because moisture, temperature, and internal readiness rarely match perfectly twice. In everyday American cooking, most mushrooms sold in supermarkets are cultivated rather than wild foraged. Cultivation brings consistency, meaning sizes, textures, and cook times stay predictable. And that makes mushrooms easier to use as a weeknight ingredient instead of a seasonal gamble. It also means the typical store selection represents a narrow slice of what exists in the wild, chosen because it grows reliably and travels well. Starting with that familiar short list is practical, and it leads naturally into the common edible mushrooms most people recognize first. Unlike the many different names you see in the produce case, button mushrooms, cremini, and portobello are the same species at different stages of growth. The small, tight-capped button is harvested young, before the cap has a chance to stretch and open. Cremini are harvested later, usually with a brown skin and a slightly more developed feel. Portobellos are the fully open caps, often about the width of a small hamburger bun. As the cap opens, the gills underneath become more exposed and darker, and the flesh usually turns more substantial. That is why one species can feel light in a salad and hearty in a sandwich. Once I keep that life stage idea in mind, the labels start to feel like size and timing choices, not like three separate foods. When you notice that, the mushroom section becomes calmer. Because you are not memorizing new identities, you are simply noticing a cap that opened a little more. In most American supermarkets, the plain white button mushroom is the default, because it is among the most widely cultivated mushrooms in the world, and it grows predictably at scale. A typical package is around 8 ounces, and that amount can add the same kind of bulk as a couple of chopped onions, bringing volume without steering a dish into an unfamiliar direction. The taste is mild and neutral, so it tends to absorb the character of what it is paired with instead of announcing itself. That is why it slides easily into casseroles, sauces, omelets, and soups. I treat white buttons as the calm starting mushroom, the one that quietly supports whatever else is already in the pan. In that role, they are less like a headline flavor and more like a soft backdrop that makes other notes easier to hear. Shiitake mushrooms are one of the most familiar cultivated mushrooms beyond the button family, and they are common enough now to show up in many mainstream grocery stores. They have a brown, umbrella-shaped cap with a pale underside and a stem that is often firmer than the cap, so the cap is usually the tender part people reach for. Many cooks describe shiitake as having a deeper, woodsy savoriness than button mushrooms, so a modest amount can make a broth or pan sauce taste more rounded without needing a long ingredient list. I also notice shiitake sold both fresh and dried, which is a quiet hint that some mushrooms travel the kitchen in more than one form. Seeing the same name in two textures, soft and fresh or dry and light, helps the idea settle in. Mushrooms can be ingredients and pantry staples at the same time. Oyster mushrooms stand out because they grow in thin, layered fans that can look like a small bouquet instead of a single cap and stem. They naturally fruit on wood, and growers mimic that habit by raising them on wood-based materials, which is why they are commonly sold in clusters attached at the base, with several caps sharing one point. In stores, oyster mushrooms can be pale gray, cream, or even pink or yellow, depending on the variety, and the color is mostly about the strain and growing conditions rather than a guarantee of sweetness or heat. When I see that clustered, fanned shape, it sets me up for mushrooms whose identifying features are more about structure than about a familiar round cap. If you ever feel lost, you can return to shape. A fan, a bundle, a sponge, a honeycomb, and let the names come second. Chanterelles are prized partly for their shape, because the cap often flares like a vase and blends into the stem instead of sitting on top like a separate hat. Instead of sharp, blade-like gills, they have shallow ridges that look like gills but behave more like folds, a feature people often call false gills, and that is one reason they look smoother underneath than many mushrooms. The structure helps explain their texture, which is usually firm and springy, with less of the thin, shreddy feel you get from many gilled mushrooms. I keep the folds, not blades idea, as a simple anchor, because the next famous wild mushrooms are memorable for surface patterns too. It is one gentle rule that keeps the underside from feeling mysterious. Morels are another famous edible mushroom, and they are easy to recognize by the honeycomb pattern of pits and ridges on the cap. Many true morels are hollow inside, which makes them feel surprisingly light for their size, like a sponge with walls rather than a solid chunk, and that hollow shape is part of their reputation in saucy dishes. In the marketplace, morels are often sold dried because fresh morels can be fragile and the season can be short, and drying turns them into a pantry ingredient that stores well. When I think of morels as hollow honeycomb, it makes the next category easier, because porcini are known for what they have underneath rather than what they have on top. The pattern on morels is so distinct that it becomes a small landmark in the mind, and the rest of the list feels easier after that. Porcini is the culinary name for a group of closely related boletes, which are mushrooms that have pores instead of gills under the cap. Those pores look like a fine sponge, and they can darken with age or handling, which is a normal change rather than a sign that something has gone wrong, especially once the mushroom is dried. Porcini are widely described as deeply savory, with a faint nutty note, and in many American kitchens, the most common way to buy them is dried, sold in small bags that take up about as much room as a box of tea. I file porcini in my mind as the sponge undercap mushroom because it prepares me for mushrooms whose store appearance depends heavily on how they were grown. A small bag can feel modest, but the idea behind it is big. Mushrooms can show up as whole caps, as clusters, or as a dried ingredient that waits quietly for its turn. Enoki mushrooms in stores are usually long, thin, and snowy white, gathered in a tight bundle that looks like a soft brush. Wild enoki are the same species, but they typically appear shorter, darker, and more obviously mushroom-shaped because outdoor light and airflow encourage a sturdier form, a bit like the difference between a pale indoor herb and the same herb grown in full sun. That contrast is a useful reminder that cultivation can change a mushroom's appearance dramatically without changing its identity, and it explains why wild and store-bought can look like distant cousins. When I see how far one mushroom can shift in shape, it makes it easier to accept the next mushroom, which seems to ignore the usual cap and stem idea entirely. Sometimes the bundle is the clue. A brush in the package, and a darker little mushroom in the woods. Still the same name, still the same species. Lion's mane is one of the easiest specialty mushrooms to spot because it does not look like a cap and stem at all. It grows as a shaggy white cluster of soft spines, sometimes compared to a pom-pom or cascading icicles, and the pieces tend to hold together in thick, tender bites that can be portioned into larger slabs. The flavor is relatively mild compared with many wild mushrooms, so it is often treated as a base for savory seasonings rather than as a strong mushroom flavor on its own, which surprises people expecting something intensely fungal. With these familiar varieties in mind, it becomes easier to meet mushrooms that stay hidden underground, grow in big shelves, or arrive with entirely different shapes and habits. By the time you reach that point, the variety feels less like a test and more like a quiet invitation to look closely, one calm detail at a time. Truffles are among the best-known wild fungi, and their fruiting bodies form underground rather than rising into open air like a cap and stem. Because they are buried, they cannot simply let spores drift away on the wind, so animals become part of the truffle travel plan, digging, eating, and carrying spores onward. That reliance helps explain why truffles smell so distinctive, because scent is one of the best ways to advertise a hidden food to a searching nose. Many truffles also live in close partnership with certain trees, exchanging resources with the roots, so they tend to appear in specific habitats rather than anywhere at random. Once you frame truffles as underground and animal-assisted, the rest of their story feels less mysterious and more like a practical design. If your mind drifts, just hold the image of a small treasure under soil and a passing animal helping it move. Black truffles and white truffles are not two colors of the same ingredient, but different species with different peak aromas and different kitchen handling. Many black truffles hold on to more of their character with gentle warmth. Many prized white truffles are often used with minimal heat because their signature notes can fade quickly. Their typical regions and tree partners can differ, so the label often hints at origin as much as it hints at flavor, which is why menus may pair the color with a place name. Truffles are also highly perishable, which is one reason they are sold in small amounts, more like a finishing spice than like a vegetable side. When the main feature is aroma and timing, the most common serving choices start to make quiet sense. A small shaving at the end can feel larger than a bigger portion cooked early, because aroma is what arrives first. Maytake, also called hen of the woods, is memorable because it grows as a large, ruffled cluster at the base of hardwood trees, rather than as a single mushroom you pick one at a time. A mature cluster can be as wide as a dinner plate or larger, built from many overlapping fronds that pull apart into portions with very little effort. That structure creates lots of thin edges, and edges brown and hold seasoning well, so maytake can taste rich even with a short ingredient list. Although maytake is now cultivated, wild clusters are still valued because they can appear in impressive size when conditions are right. Its layered shape also sets your expectations for mushrooms that grow in tiers and feel more like a soft bouquet than a single cap. Wood ear mushrooms are thin and flexible, and they are chosen mainly for texture rather than for a bold mushroom flavor. In dried form, they look like small, dark curls that weigh almost nothing, but they swell back up when soaked, the way dried fruit plumps as it takes on water. Even after heating, they stay springy and slightly crunchy instead of turning soft, so they add contrast without changing the overall flavor of a broth or sauce. Because they do not melt away, they are common in soups and stir-fry style dishes, where you want a steady bite that stays present from the first spoonful to the last. They are a gentle reminder that some mushrooms are prized for mouthfeel more than for aroma, and that is its own kind of comfort. King trumpet mushrooms, sometimes called king oyster, are built around a thick, dense stem with a small cap on top, so the stem is the main part people cook. The stem holds its shape as it heats, which makes it useful when you want consistent slices that feel substantial and do not collapse into bits. Browning concentrates savory notes on the surface while the interior stays firm, which is why people compare its texture to scallops or cutlets, even though it still reads as mushroom on the palate. Because king trumpets are sturdy and travel well, they often show up in mainstream stores that carry a slightly wider mushroom selection. They act like a bridge between familiar button mushrooms and more fragile, short-season wild varieties. When a slice stays intact in the pan, the cooking feels calm and predictable. Beach mushrooms, often sold as shimeji in American stores, grow in tight clusters of small caps on slender stems, usually attached to one base. A single package can contain dozens of tiny mushrooms, which makes them useful when you want many bite-sized pieces that cook at the same pace, more like a handful of small pasta shapes than a few large chunks. They are typically cooked rather than eaten raw, because heat softens their sharper raw edge and leaves a mild, slightly nutty flavor with a crisp bite. In stores, you often see white and brown beach mushrooms, and the difference is mostly color rather than a completely different personality. Their tidy size and clustered habit are a gentle introduction to mushrooms whose main feature is texture and uniformity, and they teach you to notice how a group can behave as one ingredient. Matsutake mushrooms are prized for a bold scent that many people describe as spicy and forest-like, sometimes with a piney edge. They tend to appear in specific forest ecosystems and often partner with certain trees, which means availability depends on habitat conditions that can be hard to replicate. For that reason, reliable cultivation has been challenging in many places, and supply is often limited compared with common farmed mushrooms. Because the aroma is central, matsutake are often handled with relatively gentle cooking, so the fragrance stays noticeable instead of being driven off quickly. This is one of the clearest examples where smell is the headline and the flavor follows behind it. Imagine lifting a lid and catching a brief breath of forest air, then letting it pass. Chicken of the woods is a bright shelf fungus that grows on trees in overlapping brackets, more like layered fans than like separate caps. The flesh can be dense and fibrous, which is why the name compares it to cooked chicken, especially when the growth is young and tender. As it ages on the tree, it can become tougher and more woody, since it is built to persist longer than delicate mushrooms that appear and disappear quickly. With wild mushrooms, careful identification matters, and people also note that individual tolerance can vary, so a thoughtful pace belongs in the background. That note does not need to feel loud. It can sit quietly beside the recipe, like washing your hands before you cook. Its shelf form is also a calm reminder that mushroom shape includes ledges, layers, and brackets, not only stems. Once you begin to notice shelves on trees, the forest looks full of different architectures. Black trumpets are dark, funnel-shaped mushrooms that can be easy to miss because they blend into leaf litter. Their thin walls dry readily and become intensely aromatic, which is why they are often sold dried and used in small pinches, more like a seasoning than a side dish. Instead of crisp gills, they have a smoother interior surface, and that simple structure matches their clean, concentrated savoriness once rehydrated and cooked. They also crumble easily when dry, which makes them a natural fit for powders that disappear into sauces while leaving their flavor behind. From buried truffles to shadowy trumpets, specialty mushrooms show huge variety, and the variety is exactly why the next facts lean toward careful caution. Not to make the kitchen tense, but to keep it calm, clear, and confident, one quiet detail at a time. Some of the most serious mushroom poisonings worldwide are linked to the death cap, a mushroom that can look ordinary while carrying toxins that the body cannot simply cook away. The compounds most often discussed here are amatoxins, which can damage the liver and other organs, and even a small serving can be dangerous. A key problem is that people do not expect a plain-looking mushroom to be high risk, especially when it does not smell harsh or taste obviously bitter. Many cases come down to misidentification, not reckless intent, because this mushroom can resemble edible species to an untrained eye. When the stakes are that uneven, the safest mental model is simple. Identification matters more than confidence. If you feel any pressure to decide quickly, that is a good moment to slow down and let caution do its quiet work. Destroying angels are another group often mentioned in the same breath as death caps, because they belong to the same broader genus and can contain similar high-risk toxins. Their all-white appearance can feel reassuring, since many people subconsciously connect bright white with clean or harmless, but color is not a safety signal in mushrooms. These mushrooms can present with a familiar storybook shape, cap, stem, and sometimes a ring like remnant of a veil, which makes them easy to mistake for common edible styles. The fact that they look so simple is part of the danger, because the human brain likes familiar silhouettes. If a mushroom seems plain, that is not a shortcut to safe. It is a reminder to slow down and rely on verified identification, not on first impressions. False morels are a calm example of how a name can blur the line between safe and unsafe, because they are not true morels, even if they share a wrinkled, ridged look. Several false morel species contain toxins that can affect the nervous system and other systems, and risk can vary by species and by individual sensitivity. You may hear that some people have eaten certain false morels after special preparation, but that tradition is not a guarantee, and outcomes can be unpredictable. The safer takeaway for most listeners is that morel-like is not close enough, because the category contains both prized edible mushrooms and lookalikes with real hazards. In a world where a single word can hide multiple species, caution is a practical form of respect, and it lets the kitchen stay calm instead of stressful. One of the quiet truths about mushrooms is that many toxic species resemble edible ones closely enough to confuse beginners, and sometimes even to fool confident hobbyists. A few differences can be subtle, like the way gills attach to the stem, the presence of a cup-like structure at the base, or how the flesh changes color after it is bruised, and none of those clues are reliable in isolation. Identification also depends on context, including the kind of tree nearby, the time of year, and whether the mushroom is growing from soil or from wood. That is why experts emphasize a whole set of features, not one single tell, and why partial mushrooms, cut stems, or old specimens make identification harder. You do not need to memorize every example. If you remember one idea here, make it that lookalikes are common and shortcuts are expensive. Jack-o'-lantern mushrooms are a classic example of a bright, attractive look paired with an unpleasant outcome, because they can be a vivid orange and grow in showy clusters. They are known for causing gastrointestinal illness rather than the delayed organ damage linked to the most deadly amanitas. But not usually fatal is not the same as fine. People sometimes confuse them with edible orange mushrooms, especially when they appear on wood in dense groups and the viewer is focused on color more than structure. You may also hear that jack-o'-lanterns can glow faintly in the dark, but that glow is not a dependable safety feature, since it can be hard to see and not every observation is consistent. Color and novelty can pull attention, but the calm habit is to let identification lead. Timing is another reason mushroom poisoning can be tricky, because symptoms do not always show up quickly after eating. Some high-risk poisonings can have a delayed onset where a person feels fine at first, and by the time clear symptoms arrive, valuable time has passed. Even when symptoms begin earlier, they can come in waves, which can mislead someone into thinking the danger has passed when it has not. This is one place where general guidance matters more than details, because if there is any suspicion of a toxic mushroom exposure, the right move is to contact local poison control or emergency services and follow their instructions. You do not need to diagnose the species yourself to ask for help. The calm point is that uncertainty plus delay is a combination that deserves professional attention. There is no universal home test that tells you whether a wild mushroom is safe to eat, and many popular rules are simply myths. Silver spoons, garlic, onions, rice, or the idea that a mushroom is safe if animals or insects nibble it are not reliable indicators, because different species process toxins differently. Some wildlife can tolerate compounds that make humans sick, and insects can chew through mushrooms that are dangerous to us. Even smell and taste are poor guides, since some of the most hazardous mushrooms are not aggressively bitter or foul. When you step back, it makes sense, because toxins evolved for many reasons, and they were not designed to warn human foragers with a simple signal. In practice, identification is the test, and it is a skill, not a trick. Another everyday safety point is that some mushrooms are considered edible only when cooked. while the same mushroom can be irritating or unsafe when eaten raw. Heat can change certain compounds, and cooking also softens the tough cell structure that makes many mushrooms hard to digest in their raw state. This is one reason raw mushroom salads are less common than cooked mushroom dishes in many food traditions, especially with wild varieties. It is also why recipes often treat mushrooms more like an ingredient that needs a proper cook, similar to how beans or grains are rarely eaten raw. This is not about making wild mushrooms safe through kitchen methods, because cooking cannot neutralize every toxin. It is about respecting that mushrooms are biologically different from vegetables, and that difference affects how we handle them. Even experienced foragers tend to use multiple references, local knowledge, and a conservative mindset, because mushrooms can vary in appearance with weather, age, and habitat. Many people learn through mushroom clubs or local mycological societies, where identification is practiced slowly and corrected often, and that community approach reduces guesswork. A common low-stress choice is to rely on cultivated mushrooms from reputable sellers, because that supply chain removes much of the uncertainty without removing the pleasure of cooking. When someone does forage, careful identification and professional backup are part of responsible practice, not a sign of insecurity. With that calm caution in place, it becomes easier to appreciate how fungi reproduce and spread, because the next facts focus on spores, growth, and the hidden mechanics that make mushrooms appear at all. A single mushroom can release an enormous number of spores. Spores are microscopic and built to travel. Instead of producing a few visible seeds, a mushroom produces countless tiny particles that can drift like dust in air currents, giving the fungus many chances to land in a place that works. You can think of it like sending out a cloud of postcards rather than mailing one letter. Most will never arrive, but a few might, and that is enough. That scale is why mushrooms do not need to be large or long-lived to be successful. Once you picture spores as a quiet, constant scatter, the structures under a cap start to look like smart engineering, built for a job you rarely see. The gills, pores, or tooth-like spines under a mushroom cap are mostly about surface area. More surface area means more space to make spores. A thin set of gills can create the same functional area as a much wider flat surface, the way a folded paper fan covers more area than a single sheet. Porous mushrooms achieve the same goal with thousands of tiny openings, like a fine sponge. Tooth fungi do it with hanging spikes. These are different designs for the same job. That is why the underside matters so much for identification, because it is shaped by reproduction, not by decoration. If you only glance at the top, you miss the part doing the real work. The next detail is even smaller, because some fungi have evolved a way to nudge spores into the air. Some mushrooms use tiny water droplets to help launch spores away from the surface, rather than simply waiting for a breeze. In a simplified picture, moisture condenses, forms a droplet, and the droplet's sudden movement can flick a spore outward like a miniature catapult. The distance is tiny on human scales, more like millimeters than inches. In the spore world, that can be enough to clear the crowded space under the cap and reach moving air. This helps explain why humidity can matter for mushroom reproduction, even when the mushroom itself looks dry to you. After that brief push, the spore is on its own. Once spores are free, the fungus shifts to its long, hidden life stage, and the story moves back into the dark, quiet spaces where fungi do most of their living. Mycelium is the main body of most fungi, and it grows as branching threads that spread through whatever food source is available. Those threads seep into cracks in wood, weave through soil grains, and wrap around decaying leaves, letting the fungus absorb nutrients across a wide area. The threads can be thinner than a human hair, and they branch constantly, so one strand becomes many paths. If you have ever seen a white, webby patch in damp mulch, that is often mycelium at work. It can appear like a thin cotton layer, even though it is made of countless strands. This network approach is why fungi can exploit patchy resources. They do not need a single solid root. They can explore in every direction, lingering where food is good and moving on when it is not. As the mycelium grows, it also needs a strategy for turning growth into the next generation. For many mushroom-forming fungi, two compatible mycelia must meet and merge before the fungus can produce mushrooms. You can think of it as two halves of a partnership joining into one working network, because the merged state is what typically has the full equipment needed to build fruiting bodies. This is one reason a fungus can spread in an area for a long time before you ever see a mushroom. The underground networking has to align in the right way. The merger does not have to be dramatic. It can happen quietly, where threads touch, and then the combined mycelium expands outward. Once that compatible network is established, the fungus can switch between feeding and fruiting as conditions allow. A place can be full of fungal life and still look empty above ground, simply because the timing is not right yet. Not every fungus needs a partner every time, because some can also reproduce asexually. A simple way is fragmentation, where a piece of mycelium breaks off, survives, and keeps growing elsewhere, similar to how a plant cutting can root and continue. Some fungi also produce special asexual spores, depending on the species, which are another way to spread without needing two compatible networks to meet. The practical point is that fungi have multiple backup plans. That flexibility helps them colonize new areas quickly when conditions are favorable. It also means the fungal world is full of different life cycles, not one single template. From there, certain growth patterns become visible on the surface, even when the fungus itself is still mostly underground, leaving gentle clues about what is happening below. Fairy rings are a famous pattern created when mycelium grows outward from a starting point, like a slowly expanding circle. The edge of the circle is where the mycelium is actively exploring fresh territory, so mushrooms often appear around the perimeter instead of in the center. The ring can be only a few feet across at first and then widen over time, sometimes showing up in lawns as a circle of mushrooms or a band of greener grass. The greener band can happen because fungal activity changes how nutrients move in the soil, which can feed the grass differently right at the growing edge. Once you see a ring as an expanding frontier, the pattern feels less magical and more like a living map of growth. It is not a sudden spell. It is a slow, patient geometry made by threads. Although mushrooms can appear quickly, the fruiting body is usually temporary, and it can wither in days even while the mycelium persists. The mushroom is built for spore release, not for long-term durability. Once it has done its job, it collapses, dries, or is eaten by insects and other animals. The underlying network continues feeding and repairing itself, ready to produce another flush when conditions return, which is why the same spot can produce mushrooms repeatedly. This is also why picking a mushroom does not necessarily kill a fungus, because you are removing a fruiting body, not pulling up the whole organism. The main body remains, threaded through its food source. That idea leads naturally into what triggers fruiting in the first place, because timing is part of the strategy. Mushroom fruiting is often triggered by a mix of moisture, temperature shifts, and the fungus's internal readiness, not by one single cue. Rain can be a signal, but so can cooling nights, a change in airflow, or the moment when the mycelium has stored enough resources to afford building fruiting bodies. That is why two storms can hit the same place and produce different results. The fungus may be ready for one and not for the other. In cultivation, growers try to control those cues, because controlling fruiting timing is the difference between a steady harvest and a surprise. Once you understand spores, mycelium, and triggers, the next facts naturally widen into how fungi cooperate with plants and shape entire ecosystems. For now, it is enough to hold the sequence in mind. Spores travel, mycelium spreads, conditions shift, and a mushroom appears. Then the quiet work continues below. Many mushrooms spend most of their lives partnering with living plants through a relationship called mycorrhiza, a word that simply means fungus and root. In this partnership, fungal threads grow right alongside fine plant roots, then extend beyond where root hairs can easily reach. On an everyday scale, it is like giving a root system extra reach, because those threads can explore tiny soil spaces that thicker roots cannot enter easily. A handful of healthy soil can hold a dense tangle of thread-like growth, and that tangle sets up the simple trade that keeps the partnership running. Many of these partnerships are choosy, so certain fungi tend to show up with certain kinds of trees or shrubs, and that is one reason mushroom habitats can feel so specific. You do not need to hold every detail. Just picture roots and threads sharing the same quiet ground. Let your shoulders drop a little, and let that picture settle. In many mycorrhizal partnerships, the fungus helps a plant gather water and minerals, and the plant shares sugars it has made from sunlight. The minerals often include phosphorus and certain forms of nitrogen, plus smaller amounts of elements like zinc or copper, and which ones matter most depends on the soil and the species involved. Fungal threads are extremely thin, so they can slip into microscopic gaps between soil particles and pick up resources that would otherwise stay out of reach for roots and root hairs. The fungus also acts as a living pipeline, moving those resources back toward the root interface where the swap happens. Thinking of it as a two-way trade keeps the idea practical, and it leads naturally into why the partnership matters most when conditions are tougher. Some plants can grow without fungal partners, but many do noticeably better with them, especially when they are young, or when conditions are dry or nutrient poor. Seedlings start with a small root system, so the added reach of fungal threads can matter more than it does for a mature plant with an established network. When moisture is limited, mycorrhiza can help a plant tap water held in tiny soil pores, supporting steadier growth during dry stretches. In nutrient-poor ground, the same partnership can reduce the pressure on the plant to build a larger root system right away, because the fungus is doing some of that searching. That is one reason disturbed ground can be a tough place for new plants, since underground helpers may need time to return, and the soil has to rebuild its living structure. Not every mycorrhiza is built the same way, because different fungi connect to roots in different patterns. Some form a coating around the outside of fine root tips, almost like a glove, and the exchange happens across that outer interface. Others thread into the root internal spaces and create exchange surfaces there, still staying organized rather than turning the plant into fungus. You do not need technical labels to remember the main idea. Fungi can wrap roots from the outside or interface more intimately within them. The structure changes where contact happens and how much surface area is available for swapping resources. That variety also hints at why some fungi are easier to grow without a plant partner than others, because certain lifestyles are more independent than others. Decomposer fungi take on a different job, breaking down dead organic matter like fallen leaves, old stems, and decaying wood, and returning nutrients to soil so other life can use them again. Instead of eating in bites, many fungi release enzymes into their surroundings and then absorb what those enzymes free up. This approach lets fungi process scraps that many animals cannot digest well, and it is why dead plant matter gradually turns into darker, finer material rather than staying as intact piles for long. Over weeks to months, that breakdown helps convert bulky debris into forms that bacteria, plants, and other organisms can use more easily. It is a steady kind of recycling that keeps ecosystems from stalling under their own leftovers. Wood is hard to break down because it is built from strong plant structures, especially cellulose fibers and lignin, the glue that helps wood stay rigid and weather-resistant. Certain fungi can break down lignin and cellulose more effectively than most other organisms, which is why they are so important in forests and in compost systems that include woody material. Different fungi leave different signatures, so a log can become pale and stringy in one case, or darker and crumbly in another, depending on which fungi are doing most of the work. Those differences are part of why two fallen branches can decay at very different speeds, even when they lie near each other. Once wood breakdown makes sense, the next step is noticing how other creatures build their lives around fungal work. Some insects take fungal partnerships to an extreme by actively farming fungi as a food source. Leafcutter ants gather leaf pieces not to eat directly, but to feed a cultivated fungus in their nests, and the ants then eat the fungus they grow. Certain termites also maintain fungus gardens, letting fungi do the processing first so the colony can get more nutrition from woody fibers. Some wood-boring beetles carry specific fungi into the tunnels they carve, planting the fungus where it will grow and then feeding on it as it develops. In these systems, fungi are not just decomposers in the background, they are a managed crop. The idea is simple. Fungi turn tough plant material into food, and insects build their lives around that transformation. In many ecosystems, fungal threads can link the roots of multiple plants, forming shared networks that spread through the soil. Evidence suggests these networks can influence how resources move, including the movement of certain nutrients, and they may also carry chemical signals, though the details vary by species and are still being studied. You may hear these systems called the Wood Wide Web, a nickname that points to real physical links without claiming the network works like the internet or always moves resources in a helpful direction. Some connections can be cooperative, while others may reflect competition, because fungi are living organisms with their own needs. The practical takeaway is that underground life can be connected and dynamic, not just a set of separate roots in separate pockets of soil. Mushrooms and other fungal growth also feed many animals, from insects and slugs to squirrels, deer, and other mammals, and those interactions can help spores travel. When an animal brushes a mushroom, digs near it, or eats it and moves on, spores gain new routes into fresh ground that can be as effective as wind in the right habitat. Even mushrooms that are not eaten can become temporary shelter, a moist hiding place for small invertebrates that then carry spores on their bodies. In that sense, fungal reproduction and animal behavior overlap in ordinary ways, without needing any dramatic scene. Once fungi make sense as partners, recyclers, networks, and food, it becomes easier to see why people learn to grow certain mushrooms on purpose. Cultivation takes advantage of what fungi already do well. They colonize a food source, respond to moisture and air, then fruit when conditions line up. When humans control those conditions, they can invite mushrooms to appear on a schedule instead of waiting for chance in the woods. The biology stays the same, even in a farm or a small growing room. Threads spread, resources flow, and a fruiting body appears when the moment is right. With that picture in mind, the next facts can stay in the kitchen and look at the tools and choices that make farmed mushrooms steady, predictable, and easy to cook with on an ordinary night. Button mushrooms, the ones sold as white buttons, cremini, and portobello, are usually grown indoors in climate-controlled farms rather than gathered from the wild. Growers use stacked beds and long trays to produce a lot of mushrooms in a compact footprint, the way a bakery uses racks to hold many pans at once. The point of the building is consistency. Temperature, moisture, and airflow can be kept steady enough for predictable harvests across seasons, without the sudden swings of wind, heat, or dry weather that can interrupt outdoor growth. That steady supply is why these mushrooms show up week after week. It is also why the mushroom section can feel dependable, even when other produce changes with the month. Once you imagine those long trays in orderly rows, the whole system feels less mysterious, just quiet, controlled, and repeatable. And it leads straight to what those farms feed the fungus. For button mushrooms, the growing material is typically a composted blend made from agricultural ingredients that have been broken down and conditioned for fungal growth. Compost here is not a casual pile of kitchen scraps, but a prepared medium designed to be evenly rich and evenly structured. The idea is to give the fungus a bed that feels the same from one end of the tray to the other, so the mycelium can colonize the whole bed instead of finding only a few good pockets. When the material is uniform, mushrooms tend to size up more evenly, which matters when stores want packages that cook at a similar pace in one pan. Evenness is a kind of kindness in cooking because it reduces surprises. That careful preparation is a quiet foundation of modern cultivation. And it sets up the next idea, the starter culture called spawn. Mushroom spawn is the starter culture that introduces a chosen fungus into a growing material, and it plays the role that seed plays for plants. Instead of a dry kernel, spawn is living fungal growth carried on something easy to handle, often grain for many species, or small wooden dowels for mushrooms grown on logs. The practical consequence is control, because spawn lets a grower select the exact species and strain they want, rather than hoping the right fungus arrives on its own from the surrounding environment. Because spawn starts from a clean, intentional culture, it tends to be more reliable than beginning from random spores. It also helps the desired fungus get established quickly, before other organisms have much of a chance to compete. That reliability is one reason kits and farms lean on spawn. It is a calm way of starting with a clear plan. Shiitake mushrooms are often cultivated on hardwood logs or on compact blocks made from wood-based materials because shiitake naturally feeds on wood fibers. Log-based cultivation tends to be slow, often measured in months rather than days, because the fungus needs time to work through the wood before it can afford to build fruiting bodies on the surface. A single log can produce more than once over its usable life because the fungus keeps feeding within the wood between harvest windows, using the log like a gradual food store. That slower rhythm is part of why shiitake cultivation is often described as patient. It also explains why shiitake can feel like a bridge between wild forest habits and farm reliability. This points toward mushrooms that grow faster on lighter materials. Oyster mushrooms are popular with growers because they can use a wide range of plant-based materials, including straw and sawdust, plus other clean, fibrous leftovers from farming and food production. Many oyster varieties fruit relatively quickly compared with log-grown species, which is one reason they show up often in small farms and beginner-friendly grow kits. They also tend to grow in clusters, so one base can produce a bouquet of overlapping caps rather than a single mushroom, and that changes how they are packed and portioned for sale. A cluster can be separated into smaller fans with very little effort, which fits well with quick cooking. Their flexibility with different plant fibers is a practical reason oysters are often a gateway cultivated mushroom, and it naturally raises the question of what conditions decide when any mushroom fruits. If you feel your mind drifting, just keep the simple contrast. Logs are slow and steady. Lighter fibers often move faster. Different mushrooms have different temperature preferences for fruiting, and those preferences shape what farms choose to grow and when. Some species form their best mushrooms in cooler conditions, while others tolerate warmer rooms, so producers can stagger crops by matching species to the season or to different indoor zones. This is not about one magic number, but about a comfort range where the mushroom develops good shape and steady size instead of stalling or stretching thin. When I keep that in mind, it explains why certain specialty mushrooms can still feel seasonal even in stores. The farm can grow them, but it still has to respect what the species prefers. That thought leads into the other big controls growers watch, the ones you cannot see from the grocery shelf. Humidity and fresh air exchange are two major levers in mushroom farming, because mushrooms are mostly water and fungi respond to the gases in the air around them. If the air is too dry, mushroom surfaces can dry out before they reach full size, and caps can stop expanding the way the grower intends. If the air is too stale, growth can become elongated or misshapen, since carbon dioxide levels influence development. Commercial farms manage this with ventilation and moisture controls that keep conditions steady across a large growing area, not just in one corner. When conditions are even, the harvest is more even too. Those same room conditions also affect what else might grow in the space, which is why cultivation always has a contamination story nearby. It is not dramatic. It is simply what happens when moisture and food are present. Contamination is a constant risk in cultivation because molds and bacteria thrive on the same moist, nutrient-rich materials that mushrooms need. In a well-run farm, sanitation, careful handling, and monitoring help the intended fungus stay dominant, and small issues are managed before they spread widely and reduce yields. For home growers, the calm, practical rule is to follow the kit provider's guidance and be cautious if unexpected colors, strong off-odors, or unfamiliar growth appears, since it is often safer to stop than to guess. This is less about fear and more about biology. The same comfortable conditions that help mushrooms also help competitors. If you treat that as a gentle boundary, it can stay calm in the background, like keeping a counter clean before you start cooking. Home growing is often introduced through kits that arrive already colonized, meaning the fungus has already claimed the growing material before it reaches the customer. The kit format reduces the hardest early variables, so beginners can focus on basics like giving the kit the environment it asks for, rather than trying to start from scratch and hoping the right organism wins. Even then, small differences in household temperature and humidity can change timing, which is why kit instructions tend to emphasize observation over strict calendars. A kit may fruit sooner in one corner of a home and later in another, simply because air and moisture settle differently. That simplicity is part of what makes mushroom farming feel approachable at a small scale, and it connects to the bigger picture of how global supply keeps certain varieties common. Small-scale growing and industrial growing are different in size, but the same basic needs stay in place. On the global market, China is widely described as a leading producer of cultivated mushrooms, supplying a very large share of farmed output worldwide. That scale affects everyday shopping because it influences which species are produced in volume, how steady supply can be, and which varieties become affordable and familiar far from where they were first popularized. It is part of why mushrooms like shiitake and oyster have moved from specialty shelves to routine grocery items in many American neighborhoods. When a crop can be produced consistently, it can travel farther and show up more often. Over time, that steadiness reshapes what feels normal to cook on a weeknight. With cultivation keeping mushrooms consistently available, it becomes easier to stay in the kitchen and talk about how they behave once heat hits the pan. Farmed mushrooms arrive with a kind of predictability, and predictability is comforting when you are cooking on an ordinary night. In the next facts, we can focus on what happens as mushrooms warm, release their water, and start to brown, and on the small choices that turn a mild cap into something deeply savory. For now, just let the picture settle. A prepared bed, a chosen starter, steady air and moisture, and then a quiet cluster appearing right on time. Mushrooms deepen savory flavor because they carry natural umami compounds. The best known is glutamate, and many mushrooms also contain nucleotides, such as guanylate, that can make umami feel stronger when mushrooms share a dish with tomatoes, aged cheese, meat, or soy. You do not need to memorize the names to use the idea. In everyday terms, mushrooms can do the same background job as a spoon of tomato paste. They make soups, gravies, beans, and pasta sauces taste more complete without adding obvious sweetness or heat. They can also bring that same quiet fullness to a pan of rice or a simple skillet of vegetables. Once mushrooms are seen as a savoriness tool, it becomes easier to understand why so many cuisines lean on them in plain, practical ways. They are not only something you chew. They can be part of what makes the whole dish feel rounded. Dried mushrooms often taste more concentrated than fresh ones because drying removes most of the water while keeping many flavor compounds behind. A small bag of dried porcini, shiitake, or mixed wild mushrooms can behave more like a pantry seasoning than a fresh vegetable, since it stores well and can flavor several meals. When dried mushrooms are rehydrated, the soaking liquid often captures aroma too, and that liquid can deepen a pot in the same way the mushrooms do. Fine grit can hide in folds, pores, and cracks, so cooks commonly strain the liquid before adding it to a pot. Pouring slowly helps keep the last dusty spoonful from slipping in. The useful idea is simple. Dried mushrooms provide depth in a small volume, and the liquid they create can be part of that same depth. They are a quiet option when the refrigerator is nearly empty, but you still want a meal that tastes layered. Fresh mushrooms release moisture as they cook because their cells hold a lot of water. If mushrooms are crowded together, that released water collects, and they tend to steam instead of brown. Steaming can leave them softer and less savory than many people expect, even when the mushrooms are cooked through. With more space and stronger heat, water evaporates more easily, and the surface can brown, creating roasted notes that read as deeper flavor without any extra ingredients. This is why mushrooms can look like they are shrinking. Water leaves while the solid structure remains. It can feel like the pan is eating your ingredients, but it is mostly moisture-changing form. If you have ever wondered why a full pan becomes a smaller mound, it is usually steam doing its quiet work. Give mushrooms a moment, and they often reward patience with better color and a firmer bite. A common myth is that mushrooms should never be washed, but brief washing is generally fine as long as mushrooms are not soaked for long periods. Mushrooms can absorb some water, yet most surface moisture cooks off quickly, while bits of soil left behind can stay unpleasantly gritty in the finished dish. Some mushrooms clean best with a brush or a damp cloth. Clustered mushrooms with tight folds may be easiest to rinse briefly and then dry, since a brush cannot reach every crease. The calm rule is that cleanliness matters more than ritual. If the mushroom looks clean, a quick wipe is enough. If it looks dusty, a quick rinse can be kinder than biting into grit later. A clean mushroom tends to cook more predictably than a dirty one, and it lets the finished dish feel smooth instead of sandy. The goal is simple comfort on the plate. Many mushroom stems are edible and flavorful, so trimming does not automatically mean throwing them away. Button and cremini stems usually cook tender, which makes them an easy part of the same ingredient as the cap. If the very end is dry or tough, trimming that small bit is often enough, and the rest can go right into the pan. Some stems, especially shiitake stems, often stay woody, but woody is not the same as flavorless. Those stems can contribute depth to simmered liquids and then be removed before serving. Thinking in terms of texture for chewing versus flavor for liquid helps each part of the mushroom find the job it fits best. Stems that are too firm for a bite can still be useful when they have time to give up their aroma. This also sets up the idea of pairing mushrooms with other flavor builders, because mushrooms rarely work alone in a finished dish. Mushrooms pair naturally with savory building blocks like garlic, onions, black pepper, thyme, rosemary, butter, and soy-based seasonings. These combinations work because salt and aromatics make umami taste clearer, so the mushroom savoriness reads as depth rather than as a separate note competing for attention. Mushrooms also match well with wine reductions, cream sauces, and browned meats, because those preparations share roasted and fermented flavors that layer smoothly. A small handful of mushrooms can make a pan sauce feel more complete, even if the mushrooms are not the main event. Pairing is less about a perfect match and more about stacking compatible notes. If the flavors already live in the same neighborhood, they tend to blend instead of arguing. Once that idea lands, it becomes easier to choose mushrooms for a dish without overthinking. You can keep it gentle and familiar, and the mushrooms will do the rest. Marinating mushrooms can help them pick up seasoning more evenly because their surfaces and small gaps can hold flavored liquids. The effect is usually stronger with sliced mushrooms or smaller mushrooms, since more surface area means more contact with the marinade. Many marinades lean on a balance of salt, a gentle acid like vinegar or citrus, and a little oil. Together, they season, brighten, and support browning. This step is optional, not a rule, and it can be as simple as giving mushrooms a short rest with a few familiar pantry flavors. It is especially useful for grilling or roasting, where a well-seasoned surface makes the mushroom taste integrated with the rest of the meal. Marinating also helps when mushrooms are standing in for a more strongly seasoned ingredient, because the flavor arrives before the heat does. A short rest in a simple marinade can turn a mild mushroom into something that feels already at home on the plate. Powdered dried mushrooms work like a quiet seasoning that disperses through a dish, adding umami without adding visible pieces. A small pinch in soup, stew, gravy, beans, or pasta sauce can make the whole pot taste more grounded, because the flavor dissolves and spreads instead of sitting in chunks. This is also a way to bring mushroom depth to foods where chopped mushrooms would feel out of place, like a burger mixture, a spice blend, or a breadcrumb coating. Powder is useful when someone wants the savoriness but not the texture of mushrooms. It can also help when you want to boost the background flavor without changing how the dish looks. Because the flavor is concentrated, a little usually goes a long way. The powder disappears, but the savoriness stays, and it can make a simple meal feel more finished. It is a small trick that does not announce itself. Mushrooms can turn chewy or rubbery when they are held too long at a low simmer, or when they cook in a way that keeps them wet instead of letting surfaces brown. Dense mushrooms like portobellos and king trumpets tolerate longer cooking, while delicate mushrooms soften quickly, so texture depends on the variety as much as on the recipe. Overcooking can also dull aroma, so the change is not only in bite, but in how clearly the mushroom flavor comes through. If mushrooms feel tight and taste muted, it often helps to give them more heat and more air in the pan, so moisture can leave and browning can begin. Some dishes want tender mushrooms in broth, and others want browned edges. Both can be good, but they ask for different timing. Once these kitchen behaviors make sense, it becomes easier to talk about what mushrooms contribute nutritionally and why certain species attract extra attention beyond taste. Mushrooms are often described as low-calorie because most of their weight is water, so a serving can feel generous without bringing the same energy as a serving of grains, nuts, or cheese. That makes them useful when you want volume in soups, sauces, and sautés, because they add coverage and bulk the way extra vegetables do, but they do not add much fat or starch on their own. The exact nutrition varies by species and preparation, yet the pattern holds across common culinary mushrooms. When a big pile of raw mushrooms cooks down into a smaller mound, you are mostly watching water leave, while the remaining solids become more concentrated. That change helps explain why mushrooms can taste richer than their calorie reputation suggests. It is not that they become heavier in the pan. It is that their flavor becomes easier to notice once the water has moved on. Mushrooms contribute some protein, but they are usually a supporting source rather than the main event, especially compared with meat, beans, eggs, or dairy. The helpful part is that their protein comes packaged with a savory, chewable ingredient that blends into mixed dishes, from chili to pasta sauce to tacos, without needing much extra prep besides slicing. In everyday cooking, mushrooms can make a smaller portion of meat, tofu, or beans feel more substantial by adding bite and bulk. That can help a meal feel balanced without forcing the recipe to change direction. I think of mushrooms as a quiet structural ingredient. They give the plate a more there feeling, even when the protein numbers are modest. If you have ever stretched a pot of stew with a handful of mushrooms, you have felt this effect without needing to name it. Many mushrooms contain dietary fiber, including beta-glucans and chitin, and those fibers are part of what gives mushrooms their springy structure. Fiber is not digested the same way as sugars or starches, so it can influence fullness and the steady feeling of a meal, even when the mushroom itself tastes mild. Cooking can soften mushrooms, but it does not remove the basic framework of those structural fibers, which is why cooked mushrooms still keep a distinct bite instead of melting the way some vegetables do. If raw mushrooms feel harder to tolerate for some people, it is often because the cell structure is tougher before heat breaks it down, not because the mushroom is bad. In other words, texture and comfort can depend on how the mushroom is prepared, and gentle heat can make the experience smoother. In the produce aisle, mushrooms are a steady source of several B vitamins, especially riboflavin and niacin, with smaller amounts of others depending on the species. You do not need to remember every name to keep the idea. In plain terms, these vitamins help the body run everyday systems that turn food into usable energy from the meals you eat. Levels can vary with growing conditions and storage time, and B vitamins are generally water-soluble, so handling and cooking style can nudge how much ends up on the plate. Still, mushrooms remain one of the few savory, low-calorie ingredients that regularly contribute these vitamins without requiring special recipes or fortification. They do it quietly, in the background, the same way they quietly deepen a soup or a sauce. Mushrooms can contribute minerals such as selenium, copper, and potassium, although amounts can vary from one mushroom to another. Fungi absorb minerals from what they grow on, so a mushroom raised on one substrate may not match a mushroom raised on another, even if they look similar and share the same name at the store. That variability is why nutrition labels do not always line up perfectly across brands. It is also why mushrooms work best as one contributor among many, not as a precise mineral tool. When I plan meals, I treat mushrooms like a rotation ingredient, useful and worth repeating, while letting variety across the rest of the plate handle the bigger nutrition picture. A steady rotation is often calmer than trying to make one ingredient do everything. Certain mushrooms can provide vitamin D when they are exposed to ultraviolet light because a compound in the mushroom can be converted into vitamin D2 under that exposure. Some growers use UV light during production, and some packages are labeled to show higher vitamin D, which is why 2 cartons of the same species can differ in a way you cannot see by looking. Vitamin D2 is not identical to vitamin D3, but labels typically count both under the same vitamin D line, so the practical point is to rely on the printed amount rather than guessing. It is a rare case where light exposure can change a nutrient value in a food without changing the variety or the recipe. If you want the benefit, the calm method is simple. Read the label and let the label do the remembering for you. Across many cultures, specific mushrooms have been used in traditional practices for a long time, sometimes prepared as teas, broths, powders, or tinctures, depending on local habits and what could be gathered or traded. These traditions are part of cultural history, but they are not the same thing as modern clinical evidence, and reputation can travel faster than proof as stories move between regions. Another complication is naming, because one common name can refer to different species in different places, and different species can have different chemistry even when they look broadly similar to a non-expert. The practical takeaway is that curiosity is fine, but precision matters when a mushroom is being discussed as more than food. Names, preparation, and context all matter, and small differences can change what a claim actually refers to. Reishi and turkey tail are two mushrooms that appear often in research discussions because they contain complex compounds, including polysaccharides, that scientists study for immune-related activity. Being studied is not the same as being proven to treat disease, and results can depend on preparation, concentration, and the people being studied, so it helps to keep claims modest and specific. In stores, these mushrooms are frequently sold as extracts or supplements rather than as fresh food, which means products can vary a lot in strength, added ingredients, and quality control. No mushroom product should replace medical treatment or professional advice. Questions about supplements are best handled using current guidance from a qualified clinician, especially if a person has a medical condition or takes other medications. This is not meant to shut down interest. It is meant to keep interest grounded, so the line between food, tradition, and claims stays clear. Cordyceps is a name used for a group of fungi, and in the wild, some species develop in close relationship with insects as part of a natural life cycle. Because the dramatic wild forms shown in photos can be rare and difficult to harvest, many products labeled cordyceps use cultivated species grown on grains or other media, which may not match the famous wild image or its exact chemistry. That does not automatically make a product good or bad, but it does mean the name on the front can hide important differences in what is actually inside. With nutrition, tradition, and biology all meeting in one ingredient, it becomes even more fascinating to look at the mushrooms that glow, shimmer, or behave in ways most foods never could. And that curiosity can stay gentle, like a small lamp in the background, guiding us toward the next set of facts. Some mushrooms can produce their own light, a phenomenon called bioluminescence that can show up as a soft greenish glow in darkness. The light comes from a chemical reaction inside the fungus, where a light-emitting compound and an enzyme work together in the presence of oxygen, a bit like the way a glow stick shines after its ingredients mix. Only a small fraction of known mushroom species glow, and even in those, the light can be faint. It can be easiest to notice after your eyes adjust to very low light, when the world feels quieter and details soften. When you remember that the glow is built-in chemistry, it becomes easier to understand why it can appear in some parts of the mushroom and not others. In some species, the gills glow more than the cap. In others, the mycelium on wood can glow while the fruiting body looks ordinary. People often ask what glowing mushrooms are for. The calm answer is that the purpose can vary, and in some cases, it may not be a single neat function. Some evidence suggests the glow can attract insects in dark forest environments, and those insects can brush against the mushroom and help move spores around. In that story, the glow is less like a lamp and more like a small cue that brings a visitor close enough for contact. In other cases, researchers discuss the glow as a side effect of metabolism, meaning it could be connected to how certain fungi handle reactive compounds during growth rather than a spotlight designed for an audience. The practical way to hold this is that nature does not always do one job per feature. A glow can be useful, neutral, or context-dependent. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is a reminder that mushrooms still have many quiet surprises left to map, and you do not have to solve them all tonight. The fungus, often called the bleeding tooth, is famous because young specimens can form bright red droplets on a pale surface, making the mushroom look like it is beating with colored liquid. Those droplets are not a sign of injury in the human sense. They are a natural exudate, a fluid that can carry pigments and compounds produced by the fungus as it grows. The color can deepen or fade as the mushroom ages, and the overall look can change with humidity. So two specimens can appear quite different even when they are the same species. It is also a good example of why appearance alone is not a safe guide to edibility. Striking looks can belong to mushrooms that are not food. If you keep that in mind, the next unusual behavior, using smell as a strategy, feels less strange and more like another practical design. Stinkhorn mushrooms are known for producing a powerful odor that many people compare to decaying organic material, and that smell is a deliberate spore-spreading strategy. Instead of relying mainly on wind, stinkhorns often package spores in a sticky coating. The odor draws flies and other insects that land, pick up spores, and carry them away. On an everyday scale, it is like using scent the way a bakery uses warm bread aroma, except the audience is insects rather than humans. The fruiting body itself can appear quickly and then fade. Once insects have done their work, the spores have already traveled. This is one of the clearest examples where mushroom reproduction is less about beauty and more about efficient logistics. When you frame it as a simple delivery plan, the strong smell becomes part of the story, not a random detail. Birds' nest fungi look like tiny cups filled with little bead-like packets, and those packets are built for rain-driven dispersal. When a raindrop hits the cup, the impact can splash the packets out, sending them several inches or more, which is a meaningful distance at the scale of a forest floor. Some species add a cord-like strand that can stick to nearby stems or twigs, helping the packet catch and hang rather than simply fall straight down. It is a simple physics trick, using gravity and splash the way a child might flick droplets from a spoon, but repeated across many cups. When you imagine a wet night and a steady drizzle, it becomes easy to picture how often this can happen. A mushroom turns weather into a launch system, and it makes you notice how many fungi are shaped around the movement of spores. The fungus commonly called dead man's fingers forms dark, finger-shaped structures from decaying wood, often in clusters that can look like a small hand rising from a log. Despite the dramatic nickname, it is best understood as a fruiting body shaped for spore release, with a firm surface that can persist longer than fragile, gilled mushrooms. These structures often start lighter in color and then darken as spores mature, so the finger-like look can become more pronounced over time. In everyday terms, it is another reminder that mushrooms are not required to have caps, stems, or gills to be successful. The goal is spores, not a standard silhouette. Once your expectations loosen, Earth stars make perfect sense as a different way to package the same basic job. With a shape that looks like a small opening flower made of dry rays, Earth star fungi begin as round balls and then split open into pointed rays that fold back, creating a star-like shape that lifts the spore sac above the ground. The opening action is often influenced by moisture, because some Earth stars can curl and uncurl as conditions change, using humidity like a natural hinge. By raising the spore sac and exposing it, the Earth star improves the chance that wind, raindrops, or passing animals will help shake spores free. On a kitchen scale, it is like propping up a spice jar so it can sprinkle more easily when tapped, except the tapping might be a raindrop or a footstep nearby. It is quiet engineering, built from simple movement. That simple mechanical design leads naturally to puffballs, which are built as spore containers first and mushrooms second, with a job that is mostly about what happens at the moment of release. Puffballs are rounded fungi that hold spores inside, and when the spores mature, the puffball releases them through an opening when pressure hits the surface. A raindrop, a falling twig, or a gentle step nearby can produce a visible puff, which is simply a cloud of spores being pushed out into the air like flour from a squeeze bag. Some puffballs are small like marbles, while others can be as large as a melon, and the size difference mainly changes how many spores can be stored and how long the structure lasts. In the simplest view, a puffball is a spore storage tank with a built-in nozzle that activates when the environment provides a tap. Once you see that puff as a dispersal mechanism, color becomes the next unusual feature that often signals chemistry at work, and it reminds you that surfaces can change with time and light. Violet webcap mushrooms are known for vivid purple coloring when fresh, and that color comes from pigments produced by the fungus, not from anything placed on the surface. Over time, the color can fade or shift as the mushroom dries, ages, or is exposed to sunlight. So a purple mushroom can become brownish and ordinary-looking later, which can complicate casual identification. The webcap group includes many species, and some are considered toxic, which is a calm reminder that bright color is not a reliable warning sign, and dull color is not a reliable safety sign either. Mushroom colors are often about pigments and life stage, not about a clear label a person can read at a glance. From glowing chemistry to splash launches to pigments, mushrooms show off their variety in ways that naturally connect to how humans have talked about them for centuries. Mushrooms show up in human art and decoration, partly because they are easy to recognize with just a few lines. A cap, a stem, and a cluster on the ground can read clearly in a tiny drawing, the way a simple leaf shape does. So mushrooms fit well in everything from carved patterns to painted borders. In some traditions, artists included mushrooms as part of landscape details, alongside flowers, insects, and small animals, as a shorthand for the wild places people walked through. Even when the artwork is stylized, the mushroom silhouette stays surprisingly consistent, which suggests it has been a stable visual idea across many cultures. That steady presence in art sets up why mushrooms also gained a steady presence in stories. A simple outline can travel far, and it can stay recognizable even when the meaning shifts around it. In folklore, mushrooms are often treated as in-between things because they appear quickly, vanish quickly, and can seem to arrive without an obvious cause. Fairy rings in grass, sudden flushes after rain, and unusual shapes invited explanations that were more myth than biology, especially before people understood spores and mycelium. Many stories use mushrooms as signs of hidden activity in the land, whether that activity is spirits, luck, or a boundary between ordinary and unusual spaces. The underlying pattern is that rapid change makes humans reach for narrative, because a thing that appears overnight feels like it needs a reason. If you want to hold the idea gently, you can think of mushrooms as a prompt. They invite imagination because they change the scene so quickly, and then the scene becomes quiet again. Once the story layer is acknowledged, it becomes easier to see how everyday food traditions kept mushrooms grounded in practical life. Mushroom foraging traditions are strong in many parts of Europe and Asia, where wild mushrooms have long been treated as seasonal foods with local pride. In some regions, markets sell a wide variety when the season is right, and people learn early which species belong to their area, much the way people learn which berries are safe and common. Knowledge travels through families, neighbors, and shared meals, not only through books, and that shared learning makes the practice feel normal instead of daring. A child might grow up knowing which mushrooms belong in soup, which are dried for winter, and which are simply admired and left alone. In that way, mushrooms are not only a curiosity. They are part of the seasonal rhythm of shopping and cooking, tied to weather, forests, and familiar routes. In North America, foraging exists too, but it often feels more niche and more cautious, partly because fewer households grow up with shared identification habits across generations. That difference is not about mushrooms themselves. It is about how knowledge travels, whether it is carried in families, in communities, or mainly through field guides, classes, and clubs that a person chooses later in life. When knowledge is shared widely, a person can learn by repetition and gentle correction, and naming becomes a common language. When knowledge is less widespread, beginners may feel they have to be perfect immediately, which can raise anxiety and slow learning. The result is often a culture of careful restraint, which can be a good habit, but it can also make mushrooms feel more mysterious than they need to be. The calm point is that culture shapes confidence, and confidence shapes how often mushrooms end up on the table. Even within one country, mushroom knowledge tends to be local, because the same common name can refer to different species, and the same species can look different depending on weather and age. A person who grew up in one region might have a reliable mental picture of a chanterelle or a bolete, then travel and find that the local mushrooms with the same nickname are not identical. That is why experienced foragers often lean on habitat clues, like which trees are nearby and whether the mushroom is coming from wood or soil, because those details travel better than casual names do. Local knowledge also explains why certain mushrooms become signature ingredients in particular places, turning into something people talk about with pride, like a local cheese or a local fruit. Once naming is seen as regional, it makes sense that mushrooms also collect different meanings in different social settings. In one place, they are a staple. In another, they are a special treat. And in another, they are mainly a symbol in stories. Some cultures have used specific mushrooms in rituals and ceremonies, usually because certain species were associated with strong shifts in perception, or because the mushrooms carried symbolic meaning. These practices are not a general idea that mushrooms are mystical. They are specific relationships between a community and a particular organism, shaped by tradition, rules, and context. It is also an area where modern conversations can get messy, because legality and safety matter, and confusing one species for another can be dangerous. The calm, responsible frame is that ritual use exists in human history, but it does not translate into casual guidance, and it depends heavily on culture and careful knowledge. If you keep the focus on history and context, the idea stays grounded. It becomes less about mystery and more about how humans attach meaning to living things, sometimes through food, sometimes through ceremony, and sometimes through both. Archaeology offers a quieter window into how long humans have noticed fungi, including the famous case of the Alpine Iceman, a mummy dated to roughly over 5,000 years ago, found with pieces of dried fungi. Researchers often identify those fungi as species like tinder fungus and birch polypore, and many interpretations focus on practical uses such as fire-starting materials or simple utility items, though the exact reasons are still discussed. What matters for this episode is not a single final answer. It is the fact that fungi were worth carrying, which means they had value beyond being a random forest curiosity. It is a reminder that mushrooms and other fungi have been part of human kits for a long time, not only part of human meals. They could be tools, supplies, and useful pieces of the landscape, gathered with intention and kept close. Today, mushroom hunting is both a culinary pursuit and a recreational practice, and it often looks more like bird watching than like grocery shopping. People track seasons, rainfall, and habitats, and they return to familiar areas the way gardeners return to a favorite nursery, looking for the same patterns year after year. The goal is not only a basket, the goal can be attention, a walk with a purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of noticing what is usually overlooked. Because risks exist, many foragers build habits around careful identification and restraint, treating uncertainty as a reason to stop, not a reason to gamble. In many places, land access rules also matter, since public lands, private property, and protected areas all have different expectations about what can be collected. That mix of food, nature, and rule following is one reason the community side of mushroom hunting has become so important. Learning feels calmer when it is shared. Field guides and mushroom clubs exist because identification is easier when it is shared, compared, and corrected in calm ways. Guides teach people to look at multiple features such as underside structure, stem details, habitat, and how a mushroom changes with age, instead of relying on one magic clue. Clubs and mycological societies often create learning spaces where beginners can see many specimens at once and hear experienced people explain what makes two similar mushrooms different. This group approach reduces the pressure to be right on the first try, and it helps people learn the language of mushrooms without turning it into a high-pressure test. People can ask simple questions, handle real specimens, and hear the quiet reasoning behind an identification. When a hobby depends on careful observation, community becomes part of the safety net as well as part of the enjoyment. The learning becomes slower, steadier, and more forgiving. Mushroom festivals show up in many regions as a way to celebrate local harvest seasons and the foods tied to those seasons. They often combine foraging culture with cooking demonstrations, tastings, art, and talks, turning mushrooms into a shared regional identity, the way apples, chilies, or seafood become seasonal anchors elsewhere. Festivals also reflect the economic side of mushrooms, because a good season can support local sellers, restaurants, and small farms that specialize in certain varieties. Even if a person never forages, a festival can make the mushroom world feel less mysterious by showing how many forms and flavors exist beyond the supermarket carton. That long thread of art, story, tradition, and community brings us naturally to the final facts. Mushrooms are not just ingredients or symbols. They are quiet workers shaping the environments we live in. Some fungi become especially noticeable after fire because certain species fruit readily in burned landscapes where the ground has been cleared and nutrients have shifted. In the months after a burn, you can sometimes see mushrooms appear in places that looked empty before, responding to charcoal, ash, and newly available dead roots and wood. The calm point is that fire does not end fungal life. It changes the menu, and fungi are often among the first recyclers to move into that new chapter. After a burn, fresh dead material can be everywhere, and the surface can hold water differently, which gives fungi new chances to work. Fire can also clear away shade and litter, so the first flushes may stand out more clearly to your eye. when you see mushrooms in a scarred landscape. It can help to remember that the underground network may have survived below the hottest layer, waiting for a new opening. Those early waves of fungal activity can support the slow return of plants by restarting nutrient flow, turning what is stranded into something usable again. Just hold the simple picture. Fire resets the scene, and fungi begin the quiet cleanup. Mycelium also helps shape soil in a very physical way, because its threads weave through particles and create a kind of living net. When soil is held together by root hairs and fungal threads, it is less likely to blow or wash away during heavy rain, and water can soak in more evenly instead of running off the surface. That steadier soak can matter for seedlings, because the thin top layer is where a new root is trying to find water before it can reach deeper reserves. Over time, the threads can help soil form small clumps that stay intact, which makes the ground easier for water to enter and easier for roots to explore. On a home scale, it is like the difference between loose, dry flour and a dough that has been kneaded into a connected structure, because connected material holds together under stress. This quiet soil stitching is one reason fungi matter even when you never see a mushroom at all. Much of their work is simply holding, binding, and making space for life to keep going. Some fungi are studied for mycoremediation, which is a broad term for using fungi to help break down or transform certain pollutants in soil or water. Certain species can digest parts of petroleum products, dyes, or other complex organic compounds. And researchers explore this because fungal enzymes are good at taking apart sturdy molecules. Results depend heavily on conditions, and it is not a universal cleanup trick, so it is best understood as a promising tool that sometimes works well in specific settings rather than as a guarantee. Even when it works, it usually needs the right moisture, oxygen, temperature, and time, plus careful planning for the site. Still, the idea highlights a bigger truth, that fungi are chemical specialists built to take complex material and turn it into simpler pieces. That ability is the same general talent they use when they soften wood and leaf litter in the first place. Fungal decomposition also influences the carbon cycle, because breaking down wood and plant debris determines how long carbon stays locked in solid form versus returning to air and soil. Wood is not just a pile of leftovers. It is a major storage place for carbon in forests, and fungi are among the main organisms that can move that stored carbon along. Some of that carbon becomes fungal biomass, some becomes soil organic matter, and some is released over time as decomposition continues. In other words, fungi help set the tempo, deciding whether carbon stays bound for longer or moves back into circulation sooner. Climate, moisture, and the kinds of decomposers present all shape that tempo, which is why the same kind of log can persist or vanish at different speeds. When you zoom out, fungi are part of the timing system for how landscapes store and release resources. It makes mushrooms feel less like a niche ingredient and more like a background process shaping whole ecosystems. Mushrooms also tend to appear after many kinds of disturbance, not only fire, because storms, pruning, construction, and tree falls create fresh dead material and new moisture patterns. A sudden cluster on a stump or along a fallen branch is often the visible sign of a fungus taking advantage of a new food source that was not available the year before. This is why mushrooms can seem to arrive out of nowhere, since the mycelium may have been present and waiting for the right opportunity. The fruiting body is the announcement, and the disturbance is often the reason the announcement happens now. Once you think in that order, waiting first and showing later, the surprise becomes easier to explain. Weather and climate patterns affect when mushrooms fruit each year because moisture and temperature strongly influence fungal activity near the surface. A wet spell can produce an early flush, while a dry stretch can delay fruiting, even if the fungus is healthy underground. In many regions, people notice that timing varies from year to year, with seasons shifting earlier, later, or becoming less predictable depending on rainfall and temperature swings. It is not always a straight line trend, because local conditions matter, and one valley or one forest edge can behave differently from another. Still, variability itself is a major theme in mushroom timing, and it is why seasons are often described with words like typically and often. Nature does not sign a contract with the calendar. It responds, quietly, to the mix of water, warmth, and the fungus being ready. That gentle uncertainty is part of what keeps mushroom seasons interesting to watch. Overharvesting wild mushrooms can affect local populations, especially in heavily visited areas where many people collect from the same patches. The impact depends on the species, the habitat, and how the surrounding soil and plant community are treated, because trampling and disturbance can matter as much as removal. Many land managers set rules, limits, or permit systems, and those rules are designed to protect both fungi and the broader ecosystem that supports them. The calm, responsible approach is to follow local regulations and treat wild places as shared resources. Leaving enough behind supports future seasons for everyone, and it also reduces the pressure to turn a walk in the woods into a competition. Moving slowly, staying on durable ground when possible, and leaving the site looking undisturbed are simple habits that match that respect. Mushroom diversity can be a signal of a healthy, functioning ecosystem, because different fungi specialize in different roles and different habitats. When a landscape has a mix of living trees, dead wood of different ages, leaf litter, and undisturbed soil, it creates more niches for fungi, which can support a wider range of species. A monoculture or a heavily simplified environment tends to offer fewer niches, so it often supports fewer kinds of fungi that can dominate the limited options available. Diversity is not a perfect scorecard, but it can be a useful clue that an ecosystem has enough complexity to support many quiet jobs at once. Sometimes the most important work is simply many small roles happening together. New mushroom species are still being discovered and described, partly because many habitats are underexplored, and partly because some species look similar until you examine them closely. Modern tools like DNA sequencing help researchers distinguish species that once would have been lumped together as a single variable mushroom, and that can revise what we think is common or rare. Citizen science platforms and local mycological groups also contribute observations, building larger maps of where fungi appear across seasons and regions. When many people add careful notes, patterns become easier to see, and unusual finds become easier to confirm. Each added record is small, but together they change the picture of what lives where. When you hold all of that together, mushrooms feel like a doorway into a living system that is both ancient and still being charted. They are connectors, recyclers, and quiet makers of change that keep the world running in the background, even on nights when the forest looks still. As we close, you can keep one gentle picture in mind. The mushroom we slice and sauté is usually the fruiting body, and the main organism lives as mycelium, a quiet network that can last far longer than a single cap and stem. That small idea helps everything else fall into place, why mushrooms seem to arrive overnight, why certain places keep producing them, and why forests and farms can feel alive even when nothing is visible. In the kitchen, it also explains the familiar change in the pan, how mushrooms first release water, then begin to brown, concentrating their savory flavor as the moisture finally cooks away. If your mind is ready to drift, let it drift with that thought. A hidden network doing steady work, and a brief surface bloom that comes and goes. Take one slow breath in and let it out a little longer than you took it in. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me in Sleepy Kitchen. May your night feel calm and your rest feel easy. Good night.